The crumpled $10 bill was a fragile flag of surrender, trembling in a hand far too thin, its knuckles like a string of pale beads. The boy, no, he had to be a young man, but starvation had whittled him down to the bare, brittle frame of an adolescent, stood in the grimy mouth of the alley, blinking against the brutal afternoon sun. Heat shimmered off the asphalt, making the world wavy and unreal. His gaze was fixed on a mountain of leather and denim leaning against a graffiti-scarred wall. The man was huge, a giant from forgotten age, his massive arms covered in a tapestry of ink that told stories of brawls, brotherhood, and sorrow. A Hell's Angels patch was stretched tight across his back, the winged death's head seeming to stare right through the boy's soul. This was it. This was the last, most desperate gamble in a life that had run out of options. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to melt back into the shadows where he was supposed to be. But the hunger was a physical beast, gnawing at his insides, and the fear of what he'd run from was even greater than the fear of the giant before him. He took a shuffling step forward, the worn-out soles of his shoes scraping against broken glass. The biker, whose name was Grizz, didn't even look up at first. He was cleaning his nails with the tip of a pocket knife, the picture of casual menace. "Beat it, kid. I ain't got nothing for you." His voice was a low growl, like gravel churning in a cement mixer. Finn, for that was his name, a name he hadn't heard spoken with kindness in years, flinched but held his ground. His own voice was a dry, rasping whisper, cracked from disuse and dehydration. "Please," he breathed, the word costing him a monumental effort. He extended the $10 bill. "It's all I have. I need help." Grizz finally looked up, his initial annoyance curdling into something else as he took in the sight before him. It wasn't the usual street punk trying to score. This kid was a ghost. His cheeks were hollowed out, leaving dark, bruised-looking smudges under his eyes. His clothes, a thin t-shirt and jeans, hung on him like rags on a scarecrow. But it was the eyes that stopped Grizz cold. They were vast pools of pure, undiluted terror, the eyes of a cornered animal that knew the trap was about to spring. "Help with what?" Grizz asked, his tone softening by a fraction, the curiosity now warring with his ingrained suspicion. He straightened up, and the sheer size of him blotted out the sun. Finn swallowed, his throat clicking. "He'll kill me," he whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I ran. I wasn't supposed to. He'll find me. Please. You look strong." He looked down at the $10 bill, then back at the biker's face. "Is it enough? For help?" The question was so naive, so utterly broken, that it punched through decades of Grizz's hardened cynicism. $10. The kid was offering his last $10 to hire a Hell's Angel. It was the most absurd and heartbreaking thing he had ever heard. He saw the faint, yellowing bruises peeking out from the collar of Finn's shirt, the tremor that wasn't just from weakness but from sheer, mind-numbing fear. This wasn't a grift. This was a plea from the bottom of the abyss. Grizz slowly pushed himself off the wall. He didn't take the money. Instead, he reached out a hand the size of a dinner plate and gently closed Finn's fingers back around the bill. "Keep your money, kid." He scanned the street, his eyes narrowed, searching for anyone who might be watching. "What did you run from?" Finn pointed a trembling finger back down the street, towards the industrial park on the edge of town, a place of featureless warehouses and high fences. "Croft Imports," he stammered. "Building 7. "Please, you can't take me back." Grizz's mind churned. Croft Imports was owned by Silas Croft, a local businessman with a squeaky clean reputation, a donor to police charities. Something was deeply wrong. "Stay here. Don't move," Grizz commanded, his voice now imbued with an authority that left no room for argument. He strode over to his Harley, a chrome beast that seemed to pulse with latent power. He threw a leg over, the leather of his chaps creaking. He looked back at Finn, a small, fragile figure lost in the urban decay. "I'm not making you any promises, but I'm going to talk to someone." With a deafening roar that shook the very windows of the derelict buildings, the engine exploded to life. Grizz didn't look back again. He twisted the throttle, and the bike shot forward, a blur of chrome and black leather. Clutched in his glove, forgotten until he was halfway to the clubhouse, was the crumpled $10 bill. The kid must have shoved it into his hand. It felt as heavy as a tombstone. He was riding to see Ryder, the president of his chapter, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was about to bring a war to their doorstep. Grizz blew through the gates of the clubhouse compound like a bat out of hell, his tires spitting gravel. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was jarring, amplifying the frantic thumping in his own chest. The clubhouse was their sanctuary, a converted auto body shop on the industrial outskirts of the city. It smelled of stale beer, motor oil, and Brotherhood. Inside, the usual midday scene was playing out. A few of the brothers were shooting pool under the dim glow of a neon sign, the clack of the balls a familiar rhythm. Others were at the bar, nursing beers and swapping stories. The air was thick with smoke and the low rumble of Leonard Skinner from the jukebox. Grizz scanned the room, his eyes landing on the man sitting alone at a heavy oak table in the far corner, a map spread out before him. Ryder. He was the eye of their hurricane, the calm center of their chaotic world. He wasn't the biggest man in the club, but he carried an aura of absolute authority. Tattoos snaked up his neck from beneath the collar of his cut, telling a story that only a few knew in its entirety. His hair was short, his jaw was granite, and his eyes, when they looked at you, seemed to weigh your soul. He was planning a charity toy run, a public-facing event that kept the local authorities placated. Grizz strode over, his heavy boots thudding on the concrete floor. He slapped the crumpled $10 bill down on the map. Ryder looked up, his expression unreadable. "What's this, Grizz? You short for a beer?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "I just met a kid," Grizz said, pulling up a chair without being invited. "A boy. Looks maybe 16, scared out of his mind. Starving. Said he ran from Croft Imports. Begged me for help. Offer me this." He tapped the $10 bill. His last $10, a few of the guys at the bar overheard and chuckled. "Croft Imports? The guy who imports fancy furniture." One of them scoffed. Kid probably got fired for being lazy and cooked up a story. Ryder didn't laugh. He stared at the $10 bill, then at Grizz's face. He knew his sergeant at arms. Grizz wasn't prone to flights of fancy. "What did you see?" Ryder asked, his voice quiet, cutting through the nearby chatter. "I saw fear, the real kind," Grizz said, leaning forward. "The kind you see in a dog that's been beaten its whole life. He was bruised, rail-thin. Said a man named Silas was going to kill him for running. The name Silas Croft hung in the air." Ryder's eyes narrowed. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. And for a moment, he wasn't in the clubhouse anymore. He was 20 years in the past, standing in a sterile hospital corridor. He was remembering his younger sister, Jenna. He remembered the way her abusive husband had isolated her, worn her down, made her a ghost in her own life. He remembered the hollow look in her eyes, the same haunted vacancy Grizz had just described. He remembered the phone call he had ignored, thinking it was just another dramatic fight. He remembered the call from the police that came 3 hours later. The memory was a shard of glass in his soul, one he'd carried for 2 decades. It was the ghost that rode on his shoulder, the reason he'd forged the chapter's unspoken code. They didn't suffer abusers. They were monsters, yes, but they had their own laws, and protecting the defenseless was the first and most sacred. He looked back at Grizz, and his expression was terrifyingly calm. "Where is he?" Told him to wait in the alley off 12th and Miller. But he was terrified. He might have bolted. Ryder slowly folded the $10 bill, his movements precise, deliberate. He tucked it into the breast pocket of his vest, over his heart. It felt like an oath. "Sock it," Ryder called out, his voice ringing with command. A younger biker with a laptop bag, slung over his shoulder, looked up from the bar. "Pull up everything you can on Silas Croft and Croft Imports. Financials, property holdings, shipping manifests. Everything. I want to know what he had for breakfast." He then turned to Grizz. "Take Bones and head back to that alley. If the kid is there, you bring him here. You tell him he's safe. If he's not, you sit on that alley and you wait." The casual atmosphere of the clubhouse had evaporated. The jukebox seemed to fade. The pool game stopped. Every man in the room was watching Ryder, feeling the shift in the air. This was no longer about a charity run. This was club business. And the rest of you, Ryder said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that carried more menace than any shout. Get ready for a ride. We're going to take a closer look at Mr. Croft's operation. He stood up, towering over the table. The light caught the silver in the winged death's head on his back. Something stinks out there, he growled. And we're about to find out what it is. The truth was a seed, planted by a starving boy with $10. And in the fertile ground of the Hell's Angels' own violent, redemptive code, it was about to grow into something terrible and cleansing. The operation began not with the roar of engines, but with the quiet hum of a nondescript cargo van, parked a quarter-mile from the sprawling, 8-foot-tall chain-link fence surrounding the Croft Imports complex. It was a ghost in the urban landscape. Inside, Socket, the club's tech prodigy, was surrounded by a nest of laptops and monitors, his fingers flying across a keyboard. He had already bypassed the public satellite imagery and was tapping into a commercial-grade subscription, giving them a high-resolution, near-real-time overhead view of the compound. Got it, he murmured. Building 7. It's isolated from the main warehouses. Single-access road. Looks like it has its own power generator. And look at this, he pointed to a thermal overlay on one of the screens. Heat signatures are all wrong for a storage facility. Too many, too concentrated. It's lit up like a Christmas tree in there, but the public records say it's designated for long-term material storage from various vantage points, the watch continued. 2 bikers, camouflaged in the overgrown brush on a hill overlooking the complex, peered through high-powered binoculars. They were Hawk and Ghost, 2 ex-recon Marines who could stay motionless for hours. They relayed their observations over a scrambled radio frequency. Got movement. Hawk's voice crackled in Ryder's earpiece. Black SUV, tinted windows, just pulled up to Building 7. 2 guys get out. Big guys. Look like private security, not warehouse workers. They're patrolling the perimeter. Ryder sat in the passenger seat of another vehicle, a beat-up pickup truck parked at a defunct gas station with a clear line of sight to the main gate. He had a pair of his own binoculars, the lenses focused on the faces of the men coming and going. They weren't just truck drivers and logistics personnel. They were hard men with watchful eyes, men who carried themselves with the coiled tension of predators. Meanwhile, Grizz and Bones had returned from the alley with grim news. Finn was gone. They had found a small, scuffed-up patch of dirt where he had been standing, and nothing more. Grizz was beside himself with guilt, pacing like a caged bear back at the clubhouse. Ryder had ordered him to stand down and wait. He's scared, Grizz, Ryder had said over the radio, his voice calm but firm. He ran. We'll find him. But right now, we need to know what he was running from. We go in blind. We get him, and everyone else killed. The everyone else was the part that was starting to chill them all. Over the next 48 hours, a horrifying picture began to emerge. They logged the truck movements. Food deliveries were sparse, ridiculously so for the number of heat signature Socket had identified. Waste removal was almost non-existent. No one ever seemed to leave the building for recreation. The only people who came and went were the guards and Silas Croft himself, who arrived each day in a gleaming black sedan, always impeccably dressed, always with a cold, detached look on his face. On the second night, Ghost got a visual. A single, barred window on the second floor of Building 7 had its covering briefly pulled aside. Through his powerful lens, for just a fleeting second, Ghost saw a face. Gaunt, pale, with the same haunted, hollowed-out eyes that Grizz had described. It wasn't Finn. It was a woman. Then another face appeared behind her before the covering was yanked back into place. Ryder, Ghost's voice was tight. We have multiple civilians inside. Repeat, multiple. They look unwell, malnourished. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a mosaic of pure evil. This wasn't just a case of an abusive boss. The high security, the isolation, the lack of supplies, the gaunt faces. It was a prison, a sweatshop, or something far worse. The information was relayed back to the main clubhouse, where the rest of the chapter, over 200 members from their local and 3 neighboring charters Ryder had called in, were gathered. The initial skepticism had long since curdled into a cold, simmering rage. The story of the boy with his $10 had spread through the ranks like wildfire, and now, with the confirmation of more captives, it had become a call to arms. They weren't just saving one kid anymore. They were liberating a camp. Ryder listened to the final report from Socket. The security system is professional grade. Motion sensors on the fence line, pressure plates on the access road, and at least 30 high-def cameras, all feeding back to a central security hub inside Building 7-inch. He looked at the satellite image, at the small, isolated building that held so much misery. He thought of his sister, Jenna, trapped in her own pristine suburban prison. The abuser always built a fortress, whether it was made of walls and wire or fear and manipulation. The goal was the same: isolation. Control. He keyed his own radio. Hawk Ghost. Maintain position. Socket, I want a blueprint of that security system. Find its brain. Grizz, he said, switching to the channel for the clubhouse. Get the chapter heads. We're meeting in the war room in 5. The watch is over. Now, we planned the war. The time for quiet observation had passed. The truth they were uncovering was more monstrous than they had imagined, and it demanded a response not of caution, but of overwhelming, righteous fury. The full weight of the Hell's Angels was about to fall on Silas Croft's perfectly manicured world, and it would land with the force of a meteor. The pool table in the center of the clubhouse had been transformed. Gone were the balls and cues, replaced by sprawling architectural blueprints of the Croft Imports compound, illegally procured by Socket through a contact in the city planning department. The air in the room, now designated the war room, was thick with tension, a stark contrast to the usual boisterous energy. The jukebox was silent. The only sounds were the low murmur of voices and the scratch of Ryder's pen on the blueprints. He stood at the head of the table, flanked by Grizz and the presidents of the 3 visiting chapters, hard, weathered men named Forge, Stone, and Decker. "All right," Ryder began, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Here's the situation. Building 7 is a fortress. Socket," he nodded to the tech expert, "walk us through the defenses." Socket stepped forward, pointing a laser at the schematics. The outer perimeter is an 8-foot chain-link fence, topped with razor wire. It's rigged with motion sensors every 20 feet. They're infrared, so night vision won't bypass them. The main gate is hydraulic, reinforced steel. The access road has pressure plates 50 yards from a gate. Step on one, and the whole place lights up. He moved the laser to the building itself. The building is concrete and steel. Minimal windows, all barred. The doors are industrial-grade steel. 32 cameras cover every conceivable angle, inside and out. They're all wired back to a central security room on the ground floor. Here, he circled a small room near the main entrance. It's manned 24/7 by at least 2 guards. Taking out that room is our first primary objective. A grim silence settled over the room. This was far beyond their usual brawl. This was a tactical assault. "They have dogs," Hawk's voice added from a speakerphone in the center of the table. "At least 4. German shepherds. They patrol the inner perimeter between the fence and the building, so we can't go over the fence, and we can't go through the gate." Stone, a barrel-chested man with a braided beard, stated flatly. "How the hell do we get in?" "We don't go through," Ryder said, his eyes glinting. "We go under, and we go around. We create chaos, and we use it as cover. This will be a 4-phase operation." He began to outline the plan, his voice low and confident, each word meticulously chosen. Phase 1, infiltration. Shepard, he looked to a quiet, wiry biker who rarely spoke. "You're on the dogs. You take 2 men, you go in half a mile down the fence line where it borders the old canal. There's a drainage culvert that runs under the fence. It's a tight squeeze, but it'll get you inside the wire without tripping the sensors. You neutralize the dogs." Quietly, Shepard simply nodded, his face impassive. At the same time, Ryder continued, "Socket, you and your team will be parked a mile out. You will hack their camera feeds. I don't want them disabled. I want them looped. Make them see an empty, peaceful compound for exactly 90 seconds. That's our window. Phase 2. The breach." Ryder drew a thick red line on the blueprint. Once Shepard give the all clear and the cameras are looped, 2 teams go. Grizz, he looked at his sergeant-at-arms, whose knuckles were white from gripping the edge of the table. You lead Team Alpha. You cut through the fence here. He tapped a blind spot behind a generator shed, and you make for the security room. Your only job is to take it. Kill the feed, kill the alarms, kill anyone in your way. Decker, you lead Team Bravo. You hit the rear entrance. It's a loading bay door. We'll use a small, shaped charge, just enough to pop the lock, not to bring the whole wall down. Phase 3. The storm, a predatory grin touched Ryder's lips. Once Alpha and Bravo are inside, that's the signal. Forge, you and Stone, you take the main force. All 200 of us. We're not sneaking in. We're kicking the front door off its hinges. We hit the main gate with everything we've got. It's a diversion, a shock and awe tactic. It pulls every guard in the compound towards the front, away from Building 7, giving Grizz and Decker the space they need to work in Phase 4. Grizz asked, his eyes locked on Ryder's. Phase 4, Ryder said, his voice dropping, is you, Grizz. While the main force ties up the guards and Decker's team secures the upper floors, you and your team find the captives. You find that boy. You get them out. There will be vans waiting at the breached fence line. Your job is extraction and nothing else. No heroics, no revenge. Get them clear. The rest of us will handle the cleanup. He looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each man. Silas Croft is mine. Any other guard is fair game. We go in hard, we go in fast. We create a whirlwind of violence, so absolute that by the time anyone knows what's happening, we're gone. And so are the people they're holding. He paused, letting the weight of the plan settle. This is not a bar fight. This is not a turf war. This is a rescue. Any man who isn't prepared to die for that, walk away now. No shame, no one moved. The air was electric with a shared, deadly purpose. Grizz felt a cold calm settle over his guilt. There was a path forward now, a blueprint for redemption. He would not fail that kid again. Ryder picked up the crumpled $10 bill from where he'd placed it on the table. He held it up for them all to see. This is our contract, he said, his voice a low growl that filled the room. We were hired to do a job, and the Hell's Angels always fulfill their contracts. The darkness in the shipping container was absolute. It was a physical presence, thick and suffocating, tasting of rust and despair. Finn had lost all track of time. Hours, or maybe days, had bled into one long, terrifying moment since he'd been dragged back. The brief, sun-drenched memory of the alley, of the giant biker's surprisingly gentle touch, felt like a hallucination, a dream from another life. The reality was this cold steel box. The reality was Silas Croft. Silas had made an example of him. He hadn't just beaten him. That would have been too simple, too quick. He had orchestrated a symphony of humiliation in front of the other captives. He'd had 2 of his hulking guards hold Finn down in the center of the workshop floor. Then Silas, dressed in a pristine $1,000 suit, had calmly walked over. He held a bottle of water and a fresh loaf of bread. Hope, Silas had said, his voice smooth and pleasant, a horrifying counterpoint to the scene. It's a dangerous thing, isn't it? It makes you do stupid things. It makes you run. He uncapped the water and slowly, deliberately, poured it onto the dusty concrete floor, just inches from Finn's face. The small, dark puddle was absorbed almost instantly, leaving just a damp stain. Then he took the bread, tore off a piece, and held it under Finn's nose. The scent of it, fresh and yeasty, was agonizing. It made Finn's stomach cramp violently. You see this? Silas had murmured, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper meant for all to hear. This is what happens when you have hope. You get nothing. You lose what little you have. He then dropped the piece of bread onto the floor, right into the damp patch of dirt, and ground it under the heel of his polished Italian leather shoe. Now, he had said, his voice hardening, you will all remember this. There is no hope here. There is no outside world. There is only your work, and there is me. He had gestured to the guards. Put in the box. No food, no water. Let him contemplate the cost of hope. So now Finn lay on the cold metal floor, his body a constellation of fresh aches on top of old ones. The hunger was a dull, constant fire, but the thirst was a torment. His tongue felt thick and swollen, his throat like sandpaper. He drifted in and out of a hazy consciousness, the darkness playing tricks on his mind. He saw shadows that weren't there, heard whispers that were only the echoes of his own fear. He thought of his family, a faded memory from before he'd been lured away by the promise of a good job, a promise that had turned into this waking nightmare. He had been a fool. He had believed in a lie, and now he was paying the price. The flicker of defiance that had propelled him into that alley was gone, crushed under the weight of Silas Croft's calculated cruelty. The biker, Grizz, wasn't coming. No one was coming. It had been a foolish, childish fantasy. His world had shrunk to the four steel walls of his tomb. He was going to die here, alone in the dark. A sudden, loud clang echoed from outside the container, jolting him from his stupor. He froze, listening. It was probably just a guard, making his rounds. He curled into a tighter ball, trying to make himself smaller, invisible. Then he heard again, closer this time. A metallic snap, sharp and definitive. It sounded like a heavy chain breaking. Footsteps, not the slow, arrogant tread of the guards, but multiple sets of feet, moving quickly, with a purpose that felt different. Urgent! A low voice barked a command, too muffled to make out the words. Finn's heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. This was new. This was a change in the pattern, and any change was terrifying. Was it the police? Arrivalgan? He pressed his ear against the cold wall of the container, straining to hear. He could hear shouting now, distant but growing louder. A strange, rhythmic, roaring sound started to build, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the floor, through his very bones. It grew and grew, a sound he vaguely recognized but couldn't place in this context. It sounded like thunder, a rolling, angry, man-made thunder. Then came a deafening explosion from the direction of the main compound, a deep, concussive boom that shook the shipping container on its foundation. Dust and rust particles rained down from the ceiling. The distant shouting escalated into full-blown yells and screams of panic. The roaring sound was on top of them now, a symphony of impossibly loud engines. Motorcycles. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Hope, the very thing Silas had tried to extinguish, flickered back to life, a tiny, fragile flame in the suffocating darkness. It couldn't be. It was impossible. A desperate, insane coincidence. But the memory of the death's head on the biker's vest, the promise in his gruff voice, "I'm going to talk to someone," came rushing back. He pushed himself up, his weak limbs trembling. He stumbled towards the heavy doors of the container and began to beat on them with his fists, the impacts pathetic and small against the thick steel. "Hello," he cried, his voice a raw, broken croak. "Help me. I'm in here. Please." Outside, the world had descended into chaos, a maelstrom of violence and noise he could only imagine. But inside his cage, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Finn was no longer praying for death. He was praying for life. The rain fell in a relentless, slanting sheet, turning the industrial park into a labyrinth of slick asphalt and deep shadows. It was a gift. It muffled sound, distorted light, and washed away tracks. For Shepard and his two-man team, it was the perfect cloak. They moved through the darkness like wraiths, their black gear making them all but invisible against the stormy night. They reached the drainage culvert by the canal, a concrete maw half-choked with weeds and refuse. Without a word, Shepard slipped into the cold, murky water and disappeared inside. His men followed. The pipe was tight, the smell was foul, and the water was frigid, but 20 yards later, they emerged on the other side of the fence line. They were inside. Shepard gave a low whistle, a perfect imitation of a night bird, into his radio. A mile away, in the back of the van, Socket's fingers danced. "Cameras are on a 90-second loop," he confirmed. Go Grizz, and Team Alpha moved with astonishing speed. Grizz himself, wielding a pair of hydraulic bolt cutters that looked like a T-Rex's jaws, snipped through the thick chain-link fence as if it were thread. The section of fence peeled back, creating an opening into the heart of the compound. Grizz didn't hesitate. He was the first one through, his eyes already scanning for the targets Shepard had identified. He could hear the low growl of a dog from behind a stack of shipping pallets. He held up a hand, and his team froze. From the shadows, Shepard emerged. He held a piece of treated steak in his hand. He made a low, clicking sound with his tongue. The German Shepherd trotted into view, its initial suspicion overridden by the scent of the meat and the calm, confident energy the man projected. As the dog lowered its head, Shepard's other hand moved in a blur, injecting a powerful sedative into its flank. The dog gave a soft whine and crumpled to the ground, unconscious but unharmed. Shepard repeated the process 3 more times, neutralizing the entire K9 patrol in under 2 minutes. He gave Grizz a sharp nod. All clear. Grizz and his 5-man team sprinted across the open ground, their boots silent on the wet pavement. Their target was the small, windowless security office attached to Building 7. 2 guards were visible through the reinforced glass of the door, their faces illuminated by the glow of a bank of monitors, all showing peaceful, looped footage of an empty compound. Grizz didn't bother with the door. He pointed to the concrete wall beside it. 2 of his men placed a small, flexible frame charge against the wall. "Fire in the hole," one whispered into his radio. The resulting explosion was a dull, contained thump, more of a violent shove than a loud bang. It blew a man-sized hole clean through the concrete. Before the dust even settled, Team Alpha was through it. The 2 guards, stunned by the sudden violence, barely had time to reach for their sidearms before they were overwhelmed. Grizz himself slammed one against the monitors, the glass shattering in a shower of sparks. The fight was over in 5 seconds. "Security room is ours," Grizz grunted into his radio. "Kill the loop, socket. Let's start the party across the compound." Team Bravo, led by the stoic Decker, had reached the rear loading bay. They planted their own small charge on the door's magnetic lock. Ryder's voice came over the shared channel, cold and clear. Phase 3. Unleash hell. It was as if a dam had broken. From a main road, the night exploded. 200 Harley-Davidson engines roared to life in perfect, deafening unison. Headlights blazed, cutting through the rain like 100 angry eyes. Forge and Stone led the charge, a tidal wave of leather and chrome, straight towards the main gate. They didn't slow down. A massive tow truck, borrowed for the occasion and driven by a biker aptly named Wrecker, slammed into the reinforced steel gate at 50 miles an hour. The sound of tortured, screaming metal echoed across the entire district. The gate buckled, tore from its hydraulic pistons, and was thrown aside like a piece of tinfoil. The sea of bikers poured into the compound, fanning out, their engines a deafening war cry. Guards poured out of the main buildings, their faces a mixture of confusion and terror. They were expecting maybe a few intruders, a police car. They were met with an army of leather-clad demons on iron horses. Chaos erupted. The bikers, armed with chains, bats, and fists, fell upon the security force. It wasn't a firefight. It was a maelstrom. The guard were hopelessly outnumbered and outmatched, their organized patrol patterns dissolving into individual, desperate fights for survival. The sheer, overwhelming violence of the main assault did exactly what Ryder had planned. It drew every eye, every gun, every panicked thought toward the front of the compound. And in that manufactured chaos, at the rear of Building 7, Decker's charge blew the loading bay lock. Team Bravo swarmed inside, their objective the upper floors. At the same moment, Grizz and his team, having secured the security office, prepared to breach the main workshop. Grizz hefted a heavy steel battering ram. The screams of the dying engines and the men outside were his soundtrack. He thought of the kids' haunted eyes, the crumpled $10. His guilt had been a cold stone in his gut for 2 days. Now it was fuel. "On me," he roared to his men. "Let's go get our boy." The infiltration was over. The storm had just begun. The main workshop door splintered under the third impact of the battering ram, the lock shattering and the frame giving way. Grizz kicked it open and was the first one through, a pistol held steady in his massive fist. The scene inside stopped him dead for a half-second, a frozen tableau of horror. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, fear, and cheap fabric. 24 people, men and women of all ages, were hunched over sewing machines under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. They were skeletal, their faces smudged with grime, their eyes wide with a new kind of terror as Grizz and his armed, leather-clad team stormed in. A few guards inside the workshop turned, their expressions shifting from shock to aggression. They never stood a chance. Grizz's team moved with brutal efficiency, a whirlwind of motion that neutralized the 3 guards before they could even raise an alarm. One was dropped with a single punch from a biker named Crusher. Another was disarmed and subdued in a flurry of motion by Bones. Grizz himself dealt with the third, grabbing him by the front of his shirt and slamming him back against a wall with enough force to crack the drywall. "Where is he?" Grizz snarled, his face inches from the guards. "The boy who ran. Where is he?" The guard, his eyes wild with panic, just stammered and shook his head. Grizz didn't have time for it. He threw the man aside and scanned the room. His eyes fell on a heavy steel door at the far end of the workshop, a shipping container modified into a makeshift cell. "There!" he yelled, pointing, while his team began to herd the terrified captives, telling them to stay down and stay quiet. Grizz and Bones raced to the container. The door was secured with a heavy industrial padlock. Bones produced a pair of 24-inch bolt cutters from a pack on his back, but the shackle was too thick. "It's hardened steel," he grunted, the cutters barely scratching the surface. "Ram it," Grizz ordered. They grabbed the battering ram, and with a shared roar, slammed it into the door. The steel boomed and dented, but held fast. Again, Grizz bellowed, his voice raw with desperation. Outside, the battle raged. Ryder, moving with a deadly calm through the chaos of the main yard, saw Silas Croft. The man was standing on the loading dock of the main warehouse, watching the destruction of his empire with a look of cold, reptilian fury. He was shouting into a phone, likely calling his high-priced lawyers or corrupt police contacts. Ryder swung off his still-idling bike and began to walk towards him, ignoring the brawls raging around him. He moved through the violence as if it were a minor inconvenience, his entire being focused on the man in the expensive suit. Several guards saw him coming and moved to intercept. They were swatted aside by Forge and Stone, who appeared at Ryder's flanks like a pair of loyal wolves, clearing a path for their president. "He's all yours, Forge growled, smashing a guard's wrist with a length of chain. Ryder reached the bottom of the loading dock stairs. He looked up at Silas Croft, whose face was now a mask of arrogant indignation. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Silas spat, his phone still clutched in his hand. "I will have all of you in prison for the rest of your pathetic lives." Ryder didn't say a word. He just started walking up the stairs, his heavy boots making a slow, rhythmic thud on the steel steps. The sound was like a drumbeat counting down the final seconds of Silas's life. "My lawyers will," Silas began, but his voice faltered as Ryder reached the top step. The sheer, implacable menace radiating from the biker leader was something no amount of money or influence could counter. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a reckoning. "I know exactly who you are," Ryder said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "You're a man who likes to build cages for people." In his mind's eye, he saw his sister, Jenna's bruised face. He saw the hollow eyes of the woman in the window Ghost had spotted. He saw the ghost of a starving boy offering $10 for a miracle. "I'm the man who tears them down," Ryder finished. Silas, finally realizing the depth of the danger he was in, made a fatal mistake. He swung his expensive briefcase at Ryder's head. Ryder caught it with one hand, his grip like a vice. He twisted, wrenching it from Silas's grasp and sending the man stumbling backward. The fight, if it could be called that, was brutally short. Ryder was an engine of focused rage. He drove Silas back into the pristine, glass-walled office that overlooked the factory floor. The first punch shattered Silas's nose. The second sent him crashing through the interior glass wall in an explosion of safety glass. Silas landed in a heap, cut and bleeding, his suit ruined, his arrogance shattered. Ryder stepped through the broken frame, a terrifying silhouette against the flashing emergency lights of the compound. "This is for the boy," he snarled, hauling Silas to his feet. "This is for all of them." Back at the workshop, the battering ram finally did its job. With a final, desperate heave from Grizz and Bones, the locking mechanism on the shipping container tore loose from the frame. The heavy door groaned open a few inches. Grizz threw his weight against it, shoving it wide. A wave of stale, hot air washed over him. He peered into the Stygian blackness, his eyes adjusting. And then he saw him. Finn was huddled in the far corner, a small, trembling shape in the dark. He was shielding his face from the sudden, violent intrusion of light and sound. He looked even smaller and more broken than he had in the alley. Grizz's heart, a thing he thought had been hardened by years of violence and loss, completely shattered. This was the truth. This was what they were fighting for. Not an idea, not a territory, but this small, brutalized human being, discarded in a box like trash. The rage that had been fueling him evaporated, replaced by a wave of profound, aching sorrow. "It's okay, kid," Grizz said, his voice thick and choked with an emotion he rarely showed. He took a slow step inside, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "It's me, the guy from the alley. We got you." Finn lowered his arm, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. He saw the giant biker, the death's head on his vest, and behind him, the chaos of the workshop. He saw the other captives, huddled together, being spoken to in low, calming tones by other leather-clad giants. He saw the broken bodies of the guards on the floor. It was real. The thunder, the miracle, it was all real. Tears began to stream down his face, silent tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He tried to speak, but only a dry sob came out. Grizz knelt down in front of him, a mountain of man making himself small. The floor of the container was filthy, but he didn't care. He looked into Finn's eyes, and this time, he wasn't just seeing fear. He was seeing the first, fragile dawn of hope. "We're the Hell's Angels," Grizz said softly, as if explaining something to a child. "And we came to take you home." He reached out, not to grab, but with an open palm. After a long, trembling moment, Finn reached out his own skeletal hand and placed it in Grizz's. The contact was electric. It was a promise kept. The other bikers on Grizz's team, men who had brawled in 100 bars and faced down rival gangs without flinching, stood witness in silence. The sight of their sergeant-at-arms, the toughest man they knew, gently helping this broken boy to his feet, hit them harder than any punch ever could. This was the truth that broke them. It wasn't the violence they had just dished out or the danger they were in. It was the stark, unbearable reality of what one human could do to another, and the profound, gut-wrenching responsibility they now felt for the lives they had just saved. This image, the massive biker and the starving boy, hand in hand in the doorway of a makeshift prison, would be seared into the collective memory of the chapter forever. It was the moment their fight for revenge became a sacred duty of rescue. "Let's get them out of here," Grizz ordered, his voice cracking. He helped Finn take his first unsteady steps out of the container and into the light. He draped his own leather cut, heavy with its patches and history, over Finn's shaking shoulders. It was far too big, but it was warm, and it smelled of leather, gasoline, and freedom. The other bikers began to move, their actions now gentle, their voices low and reassuring. They formed a protective circle around the captives, shielding them from the lingering violence outside as they guided them towards the breach in the fence, towards the waiting vans, towards a life they thought they had lost forever. The war was won, but the most difficult part of the mission had just begun. The extraction was a masterclass in controlled chaos. While the main force of bikers kept the remaining security and the arriving, bewildered local police tied up in a confusing jurisdictional nightmare at the front gate, the captives were spirited away through the hole in the back fence. They were loaded into a fleet of unmarked vans, their windows blacked out, and driven away into the rainy night. The bikers left as they had come, a sudden, violent storm that vanished, leaving behind a wrecked compound, a dozen terrified guards babbling about an army of demons, and a story the police would never fully piece together. Silas Croft was not among those left behind. He had simply disappeared, swallowed by the maelstrom. The vans didn't go to a hospital or a police station. They went to a network of safe houses the club had maintained for decades. Secluded farmhouses and discreet suburban homes owned by trusted friends and retired members. Here, there were no questions, no judgment. There were only clean beds, warm blankets, and hot food. For Finn and the others, the first few days were a blur of sleep and sustenance. They were attended to by a team of volunteer nurses and a doctor, all old friends of the club who knew how to keep their mouths shut. The physical healing began immediately. They were treated for dehydration, malnutrition, and a host of minor injuries. But the deeper wounds, the ones etched onto their souls, would take much longer to mend. Finn was given a room of his own in a quiet farmhouse miles out of the city. For the first 24 hours, he did little more than sleep, waking only when Grizz would quietly enter with a tray of food. It was never a large meal. The doctor had warned against refeeding syndrome. Just a small bowl of broth, a piece of soft bread, a glass of water. Grizz would sit in a chair in the corner of the room while Finn ate, a silent, hulking sentinel. He didn't push Finn to talk. He just sat, his presence a steady, reassuring anchor in the kid's turbulent new reality. On the third day, Finn spoke his first full sentence. "Why?" he asked, his voice still hoarse. He was sitting up in bed, the borrowed leather cut still draped over a nearby chair like a sleeping guard dog. Grizz looked up from a knife he was carving a small piece of wood with. "Why what, kid? Why did you come back?" Grizz stopped his carving. He thought about how to answer. He could talk about the club's code, about honor, about revenge. But that wasn't the whole truth. He looked at the crumpled $10 bill, which he had smoothed out and kept on the bedside table. "You hired us," Grizz said simply. "You paid us $10 for help. We take our contracts seriously." A flicker of a smile, the first Finn had managed in years, touched his lips. It was a fragile, beautiful thing. "I think I overpaid," he whispered. Grizz let out a short, barking laugh. "Nah, we gave you the group rate." A week later, Ryder came to visit. He found Finn sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. He'd gained a little weight, and some of the haunted, hollow look had receded from his eyes. He was still painfully thin, but he looked like a person again, not a ghost. Ryder didn't say anything at first. He just leaned against the porch railing next to him, sharing the silence. "Grizz told me you have a sister," Finn said eventually, not looking at him. Ryder's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. He corrected, his voice low. "Her name was Jenna. She was smart. Funny. Married a man who seemed perfect on the outside." He paused, the old pain a familiar ache in his chest. "He broke her. Not with his fists, not at first. He broke her with silence, with control. Made her think she was worthless, that no one else cared. He built a cage for her, just like Silas built for you." Finn listened, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "Me too," Ryder replied. "I was busy. I was angry. I didn't see how bad it was until it was too late. By the time I was ready to tear his world apart, she was already gone." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a wolf, intricately carved from a dark piece of wood, its head raised in a silent howl. "I carved this for her, but never got to give it to her. Wolves, they're all about the pack. An omega is just as important as an alpha. When one is hurt, the whole pack feels it. When one is threatened, the whole pack fights." He held out to Finn. "The pack looks after its own," Ryder said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're part of this pack now, Finn. You don't have to be scared anymore." Finn looked from the carving to Ryder's face. He saw the pain there, the regret, but he also saw a fierce, unwavering loyalty. He took the wolf, its polished wood warm against his skin. For the first time since he had been captured, he felt the solid ground of safety beneath his feet. The healing would be a long, winding road, but he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would no longer have to walk it alone. Months bled into one another, turning a season of recovery into a new way of life. Silas Croft's name vanished from the papers and the society pages. His company, Croft Imports, was dismantled in a flurry of bankruptcy filings and legal battles. An anonymous tip led federal investigators to a series of offshore accounts, which were seized. The money, laundered through a half-dozen charitable fronts established by Socket, was quietly distributed among the 24 survivors of Building 7, giving each of them a substantial nest egg to start over. No one ever asked what happened to Silas. It was understood that Ryder had delivered a form of justice that didn't involve courts or lawyers. His brand of justice was final. The Hells Angels chapter returned to its usual rhythm, but something had fundamentally changed. The toy runs and bar fights continued, but a new, unspoken solemnity underpinned their brotherhood. They had stared into the abyss of true human evil, and had stared back. The story of the rescue, of the Battle of Croft Imports, as it became known in club lore, was never spoken of to outsiders, but it became a defining part of their identity. The crumpled $10 bill was framed and mounted on the wall behind the bar, right next to the club's original charter from 1978. It was a sacred relic, a reminder of the contract they had fulfilled. The 200 bikers who had answered Ryder's call that night were bound by a shared experience that went deeper than patches and bylaws. They had seen what they were capable of, not just as a force of destruction, but as a force of salvation. It had broken them open and reforged them into something stronger, something with a clearer, sharper purpose. Finn's transformation was the most profound. The gaunt, terrified boy was gone, replaced by a quiet, resilient young man. The physical scars faded, and the haunted look in his eyes was slowly replaced by a watchful intelligence. He stayed at the farmhouse for a while, but the silence of the countryside began to feel like another kind of isolation. He craved the noise, the life, the protective chaos of the clubhouse. He started spending his days there, initially just sweeping floors and cleaning parts, wanting to contribute, to be useful. Socket, seeing Finn's quick mind and meticulous nature, took him under his wing. He started teaching him mechanics, first basic oil changes, then more complex engine diagnostics. Finn was a natural. He had a feel for the machines, an intuitive understanding of how the intricate parts work together. The roar of a Harley engine no longer sounded like thunder to him. It sounded like a heartbeat. He found a strange peace in the grease and steel of the garage, a place where problems were tangible and could be solved with the right tools and enough patience. He still had nightmares, but they were less frequent now. Sometimes he would wake up in a cold sweat in his small room above the garage, the feeling of the steel box closing in on him. On those nights, he would walk down to the main clubhouse, where there was always a light on, always a brother awake, always the low rumble of a conversation or a card game to chase the shadows away. Grizz remained his self-appointed guardian. The big biker would often just sit with him in the garage, watching him work, sharing a comfortable silence. He taught Finn how to ride, starting on an old, beat-up dirt bike in the back lot, until Finn was confident enough to take one of the club's spare cruisers out on the open road. The first time Finn rode out with the pack, a sea of roaring chrome and leather surrounding him, he felt a sense of belonging so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. He wasn't wearing a cut. He wasn't a member, but he was one of them. He was family. One evening, Ryder stood in the doorway of his office, watching the scene in the clubhouse below. Grizz was losing a game of arm wrestling to Forge, to the roaring laughter of the onlookers. Socket and Finn had their heads together over a laptop, arguing good-naturedly about gear ratios. A sense of rightness, of peace, settled over Ryder. The ghost of his sister, Jenna, still walked with him, but her memory no longer felt like a constant, sharp-edged failure. In saving Finn, in saving all of them, he had finally answered her call. He had found a measure of redemption not for her, but for himself. He had turned his private grief into a collective strength, reinforcing the very bedrock of their code. Finn looked up from the laptop and caught Ryder's eye. He gave a small, genuine smile and a nod. Ryder nodded back, a rare, almost imperceptible smile touching his own lips. The pack was whole. The pack was strong, and it was ready for whatever darkness the world might throw at it next. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear leather and ride machines of thunder, Their codes of honor written in ink and gasoline. They are the monsters who hunt the real monsters. If you believe in the power of Brotherhood to stand against injustice, share this story. Comment below with your own stories of unlikely heroes. And let's keep the conversation going about how we can all be a little more like the pack, looking out for those who have been lost in the dark.